Welcome everyone for today's Lunch and Learn with Kendra, and thank you for joining in your lunch break because I know how much I value mine, so thank you. It's just great to see that everyone's so dedicated towards professional development for themselves, and that all helps our industry. Just before we start, next slide please, sorry Kendra. Just before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. Also, I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present. Cool, thank you. So a little while ago, Kendra reintroduced me to the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And I'd heard about it before, I hadn't really read it, and I found that it's actually very, very interesting, and a lot of it has been very helpful to me. So if you haven't had the chance to read it yet, please do. I highly recommend it. For those who are new joining us for the very first time, one of the things that I find that's been happening in our industry a lot is that all of the really good technical people seem to get promoted into being a manager. However, there's no real training on how to be a manager, and it's a very different job to what we're used to. So the purpose of the Tech Leadership Experiment is to try and bring together speakers who have great experience, frameworks, and have worked in this space to share ideas that may be able to help us all on our leadership journeys. And the reason it's called a leadership experiment is because not everything works for everybody, and we all need to sort of try and find what works for us, what works for a particular team, and it is all a bit of an experiment. So we have got a LinkedIn page. Please do feel free to follow it and connect with other people who are following it, because we're all in the same boat together. And I also just wanted to do a little shout out for the next session after this one, which is going to be how to have difficult conversations with people in your team. And that's going to be run by Simon Wood. And I guess over to you, Kendra, because I'm keen to hear what you have to say.
Fantastic. Take myself off mute. Thank you so much, Asmita, for the invitation to speak. And I agree with you. Thank you to the people who have dialed in. I am also aware there may well be people watching this later. So thank you for taking the time in your own time to watch the recording. But it's super lovely of you to dial in. And if folks could stay on mute, because otherwise we're getting quite a lot of feedback, but that would be fantastic. But I really super appreciate those few people who are able to and have turned on their cameras, because it's always slightly daunting to talk to a lot of icons. So hello, it's lovely to see you. And what I'm going to do is have a relatively sort of a semi-structured conversation around some concepts that I would like to talk about. And then I am extremely keen to turn this into more of a conversation. Asmita and I were having a conversation previous to this chat where she said, the challenge might be that you never know how many questions you're going to get, but I do at the moment see some people on the line who I'm fairly confident will have questions. So I certainly intend to stop talking early enough that we can turn the later part of this conversation into a conversation. So super duper. All right, so this is me. I read Radical Candor for the first time probably about 10 years ago. I think it was published back then, but really long enough ago that I have reread it and I have reread it. And there are concepts from it that I refer back to all the time. And I think someone has got themselves off mute and they're typing or something. It'd be super awesome if you could pop yourself on mute, particularly because it will impact the recording quality. And sorry, my cat really wants to play. There are two concepts from it that I find myself returning to again and again. So if you haven't read it, like Asmita said, I really recommend that you do. I think Kim brings a really, it's funny to say fresh for a book that has now been around for quite a long time, but a different lens on how to grow your leadership skills than a lot of other people who write popular books in the space of leading in the technical arena. So super recommend reading her book. I think you will find that you will want to reread it every 2 to 3 years, partly because it gives you a beautiful language to talk about leadership with other people. And when I was in my most recent role, I was leading a really quite a significantly sized team at Xero. We were big, we were physically distributed, and we were time zone distributed. So having a clear vocabulary to talk about what we meant by leadership was super important, and we definitely leaned on Kim Scott. So there are some ex-Xeros on the call and some current Xeros, and some of them will be chuckling away in the background going, oh yeah, Kendra really talked a lot about that. Oh gosh, she still goes on about that. So there you go. So who am I, and why? You'll have your own reasons for taking the time to listen to this, but to give you a little bit of background of, I guess, my journey in learning how to be a better leader, a journey that I'm still very much on, and what motivates me to take the time to talk about it. So this is me. I had to go back to my LinkedIn profile. They're really useful things to check. And I have been leading people since 2008. So I left the academic world, started working at a beautiful New Zealand-based company called Datacom, which is a fantastic place to grow a career, and ended up in a leadership position super early in my commercial career. And I went from working with a bunch of people to leading a business unit where a lot of the people in it had far more commercial experience than I did. So talk about a baptism of fire in how to build an authentic way to lead people who were probably half of my team of 30 were older and far more experienced in the commercial delivery of software than I was. So believe me, I leaned on everything I could find to learn how to be a more effective leader. That was a long time ago now, and I have had people leadership and space leadership in my remit in every job that I've had since then. So I have practiced it in many different guises and many different types of commercial model. At this point in my life, I am motivated by creating commercial value and by creating great work environments. You can certainly choose to do one and not the other. For me, that doesn't, I don't find that rewarding. It doesn't make any sense. So I think everyone needs to find their own piece with where do you want to sit in terms of being a great leader and being a great creator of commercial value, and how will you bring those two things together? Because sometimes they clash. I'm also currently really enjoying myself and fulfilling one of my childhood dreams of being an author. When I was about 6, if you'd asked me what I wanted to do for a job, I would have told you I wanted to be an author. It's I'm not that good at writing, and so it's certainly not a commercial prospect for me, but I am really enjoying it. So if you're interested in learning more about what I do and what I think about, I run that Substack. And I publish, it's down to approximately once a fortnight now. I'm getting busy, but it was once a week. So there's two sort of concepts about leadership that I think often go unspoken, but they're really fundamental to my belief. You're welcome to disagree with me, but a lot of what I'll say today won't make a lot of sense if you don't understand that these are two things that I fundamentally believe. I fundamentally believe that leadership can be learned. And one reason I really want to emphasize that is I think that there is a really, in my opinion, unhelpful and unfounded zeitgeist that some people are born to lead and other people aren't. And I believe that particular item is used sometimes to be like, yeah, but you're a really great individual contributor, and I don't really want you to believe that leadership is something that could be in your future, because you're really useful to me right now. And if I have to nurture your ability to become a people leader, you're not going to be delivering for me. So I think that there are people who quite disingenuously spread the message that you are either someone who can lead or you are not. I don't think that is true. I believe leadership can be learned. The other anti-pattern that I see a lot of, though, is people who have drunk the Kool-Aid of leadership can be learned, so therefore I will be a leader. But they often, because they are young and a little unversed in what it takes to lead people, they believe that leadership is about hierarchical position. That's the lowest form of leadership, in my opinion. If people are following what you're asking them to do purely because they're your boss, yeah, good luck being a successful long-term people leader if that is the only reason that folk are following you. So to me, leadership can absolutely be learned, but just like anything else that is worth learning, learning to lead well is not trivial. It is hard. You have to be purposeful about it, and you have to craft a leadership style that works for you and works in the industry that you are trying to lead in. And if really realistically, and I'm actually currently doing some early proof work on a book that a colleague of mine who is a super senior leader is looking to publish, and he is quite clear about he is still learning to lead. So learning to lead and learning to be a better leader never ends, partially because people are changing all the time. People's expectations of what work can give them are changing all the time. So if you are still leading in the way that you did 10 years ago, you are already 10 years out of date. So 2 really strongly held opinions. People who've worked with me before will know that I will change my opinion if given enough evidence to the contrary, but there'd be a lot of evidence to maybe want to change these ones. So I discovered Kim Scott. I think that she has a beautiful way of framing concepts and conversations that are difficult to get your head around. And she's been a leader for many years at very senior positions in very successful organizations. So I love this quote from her: being a good boss is hard for everyone. And to comment on terminology, people often want to get into the conversation between what's the difference between leadership and management. Kim tries to put those religious conversations aside by saying, hey, let's just use the word boss, because it means most people have a bit of an understanding of what a boss is. So being a good boss is hard for everyone, even one of the people who, in my opinion, has written a really profound and really useful book in this leadership space. I super hope that most of the folk who dialed into the call did take that 6 minutes to watch the video. There is a lot in the book, Radical Candor. I just want to touch on 2 things that for me have come up again and again and again, both when I've been leading people and learning to lead people better, and when I've been coaching people to lead or helping people understand whether or not it's something that they want to do, because it's a skill that can be learned. It takes a lot of application to learn to do it well. One thing I would really exhort anyone on this call or watching to this call to say is, if you don't want to put in the time, please don't become a people leader. You make so much impact in people's lives. Good leaders are fantastic. Shit leaders are awful. So if you're not prepared to put in the time to learn how to do it well, just don't do it. There's absolutely lots of really rewarding careers that don't involve people leadership. So heaps in the book. 2 things that I really concentrate on, I want to go through today, but I hope that some of you took that time to watch those 6 minutes to get a little bit of Kim's vocabulary. I'll do a tiny bit of scene setting around the vocabulary that she uses, the framework that she uses, because then I want to dive into the 2 concepts that I have found particularly useful in my leadership journey. So Kim talks about, she's got a good 2x2, just like any person who writes a business book, she has a 2x2 framework. And she talks about 2 dimensions of leadership being the ability and the care, the commitment to care personally, and also the ability and commitment to challenge directly.
Hi,
so,
I'm Kim Scott.
Okay, no, that's not supposed to happen. Cool. I love the fact that Kim is super open about the fact she does not sound like a typical leadership coach. She's absolutely fantastic, and you should definitely go and listen to it if you have not before. So the care personally, or as she says it, the give a damn axis. So she and I both have a really strong belief that if you want to lead people sustainably and effectively, you actually have to care about them. It's super easy to pick up when your boss doesn't care about you. So if you're interested in leading people or leading people better, I think it's a really good one to reflect on. You need to be able to care personally. You need to be able to take that time to get to know the folk that you are leading. And the other axis is the challenge directly. And I do think a little bit in New Zealand and Australia, this book was written by and for the American market. I think in Australia, we do have a bit of a challenge with the challenge directly axis, or as Kim calls it, the willingness to piss people off axis. So one thing you hopefully learn super early in your people leadership journey, being a good boss is not the same as being universally popular. That is also not the same as being a dick, or as Kim calls it, a jerk. But if you are not willing to piss people off, you're not really going to be a great leader, because you're not going to be able to make choices and move your team and your organization towards those choices. Because realistically, you get 10 people in a room and they are not all going to agree on what the right choice is. So some of the time, you're going to be telling people that they need to do things and work in ways that they don't regard as the right choice. And that pisses most of us off. So you have the dimensions of care personally and challenge directly. And this is the base framework that Kim's book is written on. She then says that in those quadrants around those challenges, you get these 4 ways of interacting. And she's super clear that what this is, and the reason that she put it together, it's a framework for each of us to be more conscious of the kind of guidance we're giving when we are working with people. It is not a label. A single individual leader is not manipulatively insincere, and that's their entire life, and that's every interaction, and that's how they are, and you box them in. And it's not describing personality traits. It's much more to do with, in each conversation, in each interaction, in each influencing journey, where are you sitting? How are you talking? How are you communicating? So I would super encourage you to dive into the book and get more of an understanding of what all of these different areas are. I specifically want to start by talking about ruinous empathy for 2 reasons. One, because I think it's one of the biggest challenges that I had when I was first a new manager. I didn't find Kim's book until I'd been leading for quite a long time. But I, looking back, was like, oh yeah, that's hard. It's hard if you've been told to be a nice person. It's hard if you've been told to not rock the boat. And I also think it is the biggest trap for new managers. So I want to start there, because the point of the tech leadership experiment is to help people sort of exercise those muscles and figure out if this is something that they want to do. So ruinous empathy is when you care personally. So you are genuinely, you've established relationships, you genuinely love the people that you're working with, you want them to be successful, but you just haven't yet mastered the challenge directly axis. You don't want to be seen as a killjoy. You don't want to step on their toes. You don't want to make them feel that you are telling them what to do. And the challenge with ruinous empathy, and I've certainly acted from that space before, and I've definitely seen people, certainly other leaders in my organization and other leaders around the companies that I've worked in, who are living far too much of their time in that quadrant. So Kim gives an example in her book of a gentleman who was not able to deliver work at the level that was required for the sort of the functional space that he was holding inside her business, which is a relatively small startup. But he was the life of the party, and he brought so much else to the organization, and he stitched people together, and he really just was not delivering quality work at the level that was required. And she talks quite openly and in quite a raw way about the fact that she let this go on for far too long because she liked him, and she didn't want to challenge him. She didn't want to sit down with him and have the conversation. It was like, mate, look, what is going on? You are a fabulous asset to this company in this way and this way and this way, but commercially we need you to deliver quality work, and this specific instance of one thing that you've done recently is not meeting the level of quality that we need you to do. And eventually she ended up having to fire him, and I think it's niggled away in her brain for the rest of for a substantial time of her career, that she let that person down because she didn't have an upfront conversation with them early enough on that path of, this is really not working out. And so she didn't give that person the opportunity to go and be fabulous at doing something else. And that's one thing that's really stuck with me as I've leaned into the concept of ruinous empathy, leaned into really trying to identify for myself when I'm operating in that space, when the guidance that I'm giving is in that space. Because it's not easy to work with a person who is not doing well in the job that they are doing for you at that time. One concept that Kim has, which has been incredibly helpful to me, and I think it's one that's really interesting to ruminate on, is people don't generally get up in the morning to go and do a poor job of their role. So when you actually have the strong conversation with yourself about, I need to sit down with this person and have a conversation that I'm not going to find comfortable, and this person's probably not going to find comfortable. What you're actually doing, if you look at it over the space of their career, because careers are long, jobs are short, you're giving them the opportunity to find something that they can be excellent at and they really enjoy spending their time doing. I have managed people out of organizations. I have fired people. I have moved people into jobs that they were not particularly interested in moving into, but I needed them to do something different. I'd love to tell you that 100% of those people have called me up later and said, oh, Kendra, so glad you did that. Didn't think it at the time, but it's really made a huge difference to me. And of course, that isn't true. But a fair whack of those people have. And I'm comfortable at that deep place in your soul when you're saying, am I approaching this with, with the right intent? That I have made people's lives better by being prepared to lean in, have those super tough conversations and say, in this company, at this point in time, at this time in your life, at the point in time and what this company's needs, this is not a great fit for you. Let me work with you to find something that is a better fit, because you will bring more value and you will be a happier person. So I would really encourage you, as you begin your people leadership journey, and also as you make transitions in your people leadership journey, to either bigger teams, because with bigger teams comes a lot more complexity, or with leading leaders, which is a really distinct skill that needs to layer on top of leading people. Leading leaders is super complex. Or when you change organizations or change industries, just check that you're not falling back into ruinous empathy in some of the interactions that you have with some people. And I did make the perhaps a little bit bold comment of, I think this is a particular challenge in the Australian and New Zealand psyches, but I think it is, because let me see if I can offend everybody on the call. In my experience working with Americans, I think they are perhaps more likely, on average, to fall into obnoxious aggression, at least seen from the viewpoint of a Kiwi or an Aussie. And I think that Aussies and Kiwis are more likely in general to fall into the challenge of ruinous empathy, particularly when seen from the framework of an American. I think it comes from our culture of perhaps not wanting to be upfront, not wanting to disagree with someone in a confrontational way. You're very welcome to completely disagree with me, but I think it's an interesting thing to dwell on. I had a really a sort of a ringside seat for this, I guess, because as an ex-Kiwi working in a global company on the Australian side of the company, I had really interesting conversations with my Australian colleagues who saw me as Australian and would comment on some of the challenges that they had dealing with our New Zealand colleagues from an understanding and communication perspective. I would have Kiwi colleagues who very definitely still saw me as a Kiwi, and believe me, my Kiwi accent ramps up a notch when I go back to New Zealand, who would similarly share with me some of the challenges they found dealing with our Australian colleagues. And then sometimes, because I had lived and worked in the US, I would get my US-based colleagues basically going, can you explain New Zealanders to me? So I found that super interesting, that because I was otherness enough for each of those three groups to see me as part of their tribe, I would actually get folks asking me for translation layers for those three different cultures, which are not seen as particularly different cultures on the global scale. But in actual fact, when you get right down to it, there is a New Zealand way of leading people, there is an Australian way of leading people, and there is an American way of leading people. And they overlap for sure, but they are distinct enough that I was constantly asked to interpret between those different groups of folk. So I think ruinous empathy is one where, if you are leading from a Kiwi perspective, from an Aussie perspective, and particularly if you are leading American-based teams or American folk, it's just worth really double checking that you're not falling into that trap. The other dimension, the other concept in Kim Scott's book, which I think is often overlooked, often misunderstood, and extremely important to understand, is the concept that she has of rock star or superstar. And I love this terminology because when you say such and such is a rock star, most of us have an instant belief that they understand what I mean before I say anything else. And then I say a rock star, not a superstar. And you're forced to go, well, hang on, I thought I knew what you meant by rock star. But since you've now just said not a superstar, I have to recheck my assumptions at the door. And language can mean so many things. I love language that makes people pause and check their assumptions because it means we are less likely to talk past each other. So Kim Scott has the idea of the fact that she said early in her leadership career, she was a hard driving, super ambitious, high growth trajectory person. And she believed for a number of years that that was the kind of person that she wanted in her team. And she was very lucky to be mentored by much more senior people leaders who said to her, really? Every single person in your team needs to be super ambitious, looking for the next role on a high growth trajectory? I'm not sure that's really going to deliver you or the companies that you work within what you are looking for. And they helped her to nut out in her head and really understand that to have a successful team delivering successful commercial outcomes for a company, you actually need both kinds of people, and of course a simplification to put people into a two-dimensional framework, but you need people who are working as change agents. You need people who are super ambitious for growth at work because they are going to be the people looking for the spaces to fill, for the things to try new, for the establishing relationships perhaps with other parts of your business. They're craving new opportunities. They're on a steep growth trajectory. But you also need people who are that absolute rock of Gibraltar. And that, of course, is where rock star comes from. They're a force for stability within your team. They may be super ambitious outside of work. Work may just not be the place in which they are experiencing or wanting to lean into their growth right now. Or they may simply be a person who's super contented and wants to do what they do super well. They may be very happy and very fulfilled by doing their current role with consummate skill rather than doing a reasonably good job of it and always looking to the next point. And they are folk who, is a way to describe it, is that they are currently on a gradual growth trajectory. So superstar and rock star, I have found this a wonderful dimension to look at the compositions of my teams and to try to decide how to rebalance the compositions of my teams. Because for sure, if every single person in your team is focused on the next thing, you are not delivering today's thing as well as you could be. So you need superstars and you need rock stars. So I find superstar and rock star a really interesting dimension along which to look. But for me, the real kicker and why I think this is a concept that is super overlooked is the fact that it's a phase. Kim is really, really careful to point out that you're not a rock star or a superstar. There you go, cool. Kendra is a boom, and that is Kendra for the rest of her life. You are in a rock star phase or a superstar phase. And perhaps more than any other era, what I have seen leaders do is type people as on a steep growth trajectory or not, and put a label on them that says that they are an ambitious person or they are not, and fail to recheck their understanding of that person. And Kim has a much better example than I can come up with because she's worked with some very interesting people. She said she had 2 people in her team who were Olympic level athletes. So for a period of about 1.5 years when they were training for the next Olympics, they were rock stars at work. They were super solid. They were doing a really good job. And their interest in growth was focused elsewhere. It was focused on qualifying for the Olympics. When the Olympics had finished, and I think at least one of them had aged out of wanting to continue to be a competitive athlete, all of that person's drive, ambition, and ability to deliberately grow their capability refocused into work. And they moved from a rock star phase to a superstar phase. if Kim hadn't realized that, if she'd said, oh, yeah, no, Janet is a rock star, doing a great job, leave her alone, she'll continue to thrive, she doesn't want any sort of extension or other opportunities, Janet would have almost certainly left the team because she would have just become really uncomfortable with the way the company viewed her. So it's a mistake that I'm sure I made in my early years as a people leader. It's a mistake that's easy not to notice yourself making if your team changes quite a lot or if you move organizations quite a lot. But if you are in a role for any period of time, have a cadence where you check your own assumptions about X individual and where they are in their life cycle, because I will guarantee you that if you lead people for 10 years, you will see people move from a phase to a different phase. If you can identify that, you will keep those people within your sphere of influence, within your orbit. If you don't identify that, you will be the manager who is turning around going, what? Such and such resigned? You're kidding me. I would never have picked that. They were so happy. So it's just one that I have seen too many people make the mistake of putting a permanent lifetime label on a person instead of understanding that that person is in a phase of whether rapid growth at work fits in with the rest of their life at that time. That is what I wanted to cover. I hope that some of that has resonated with you or made you go, oh, that's an interesting concept. It's something I'd like to discuss with either the team I lead today or, a team that I work with or a team that I have done in the past. Ooh, I've seen myself do some of those things. Okay, that's a really interesting dimension. I'm going to reflect on how I could approach some of those conversations differently. And I've really done my job today. If those of you who are in leadership positions are prepared to go back to the teams you lead now and just check your own assumptions about where those folk are in their growth at work cycles and whether you've labeled any of them with a permanent label, which should be a phase label. And actually, they've phase shifted since you last thought about that. And you can reach out and have a different conversation with them and hopefully keep them with your company and with your team and keep them delivering value for much longer than if you failed to make that identification. So I exhort you to go and read Radical Candor. If you're not a person who typically reads leadership books, it's not a typical leadership book. It will make you a better leader if you lean into understanding why the concepts that make you uncomfortable and understand why the concepts that you haven't considered before could be something that you add to your leadership journey. I am super keen to turn this into a conversation, take questions, hear your observations on how you've learned to be a better leader. I think we have quite a mixed group of people who've been leading for many years and perhaps people who are super new to it. I know we have a mixed group in terms of folk who have lived and worked in New Zealand, Australia, and America. So I did not intend to offend anybody, but if I did, we could certainly have that conversation as well. But I'm just super keen to stop talking and to have a chat. And now one brave person has to be the first person to say something.
I've got a question, Kendra. When you sort of talked about, when you got your team, you tried to keep a good balance of rock star versus superstar. How did you really go about, measuring that, I guess, in terms of, was it about half and half? Did you find worked well? Or, what I'm conscious of is if there was one person who was super ambitious and a team, people who really weren't, would that put them off, for example?
That's a really interesting question. And it's a much easier question to do in a sizable team, of course, because if you have a team of 3, it's going to be a real challenging balancing act. I don't think there's an answer to how many, and I think it shifts with business priorities. So if I can give an example, at Xero, there was a time when we were really focused on making sure that the company could have the space to understand how COVID was going to impact our business. there was a time when we were pushing for massive market share in a particular market. Those are different times in a company's life cycle. So you're going to need a different balance in your team of people who are really interested in growing and carving out new spaces, and people who are really concentrating on doing great work well. So it's certainly not a number, and it's a slow dynamic to change, of course, because you don't go, I have too many superstars, right, I'm going to fire some of you lot and bring in a bunch of rock stars. No, people are people, they're not fungible widgets, in my opinion. It's more making sure that it's a dynamic that you are aware of. And probably the strongest one for me is rechecking your assumptions, because I have certainly led teams long enough that I have seen people move from one phase to another, and missing that phase transition is, in my opinion, a pretty inexcusable mistake in a people leader.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you very much, Kendra. My name is Lalas. I just have one question. From your experience, how would you deal with somebody who probably doesn't handle a negative feedback properly or very well?
It's a really complex, multi-layered question, Lalas, so I'm not going to be able to completely answer it, but I'll give you a couple of perspectives. And I think for me, one of the big ones comes from, you can't change other people, you can only change yourself. So if I was working with an individual who really reacted poorly to what I would call constructive feedback, because if you're giving feedback in a way that could be that is only able to be construed as negative feedback, you're not doing a great job as a people leader. I'm not saying that's what you meant, but I think it is, our words mean a lot. So I think assuming what you mean is giving that person some feedback on something that they need to change. Yeah. One thing I'm super careful about, if I get a poor reaction to that conversation, is, have I not spent enough time building a relationship with this person, which is one of mutual respect? Because I know for myself that when I have been given constructive feedback, or let's be honest, in some cases, some pretty negative feedback, the ability that I have to hear that feedback and then make my own choice about whether I want to act on it or not, because all feedback is a gift. Not all of it is something you should action. So you do want to sit with feedback and say, do I want to action that? But if I reflect on the times when I've been given negative or constructive feedback, I have been much more quickly able to move through the ouch that comes with being feedback that you're not perfect, and make a sort of a less emotional decision about whether or not I want to action that feedback. And then if I do, who I'm going to need to enlist in my journey to action that, based on whether or not the person who's given it to me, I believe, cares about me. Okay. And for me, I summarize that as having a relationship of mutual respect. So when I need to give feedback to help somebody change a behavior that's not working for them or not working for the company, and I don't believe that will be taken well, or it isn't, the first thing I do, because the only thing I can do is change myself, is reflect on whether I haven't put enough time into building a relationship in which that person can hear the feedback. If I do identify that that's a challenge, it's a bit late for me to build the relationship, but it's a good indication to myself to remember that people are people, and we work, most of us are very relationship based. I do want to work on creating a stronger relationship with that person, or I might, because I haven't, so I've made a misstep as a leader, I might look to say, is there another person in this organization with whom I believe this person's relationship is stronger, so that they might be more able to hear that feedback if it came from that person. And so I think that's another reason why it's fantastic to build a network of peers in an organization, that you can have, really robust conversations about that, because someone might work for me, not like me, whatever. I do my best, but I'm not that likable by 100% of people, not get on with me, not be able to be effective in my organization, but they might be super talented. And if I can help them build a relationship with a peer in the organization for whom they do have that mutual level of respect, perhaps they can be fantastically helpful and valuable for my company working with one of my peers. So that's only one dimension of how we might approach the problem that you've brought up. There's so many more, but I think that's one that that's within your control. So I think that's one reason why I want to mention it.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Kendra. Could you share how you've encouraged your teams, the teams that you step into, to be radically candid with you?
Such a good question, Joseph. And it's the hardest thing to do. I think because there's such an imbalance of power. And I have had this conversation with my direct boss. I have had this conversation with my boss's boss. I have had this conversation with the chairman of the board of the company I've worked on. All three lovely human beings who genuinely crave people to give them more direct feedback. And I've worked with them to understand why they don't get more direct feedback, and worked with them and myself to try to figure out how to make an environment in which you are more likely to. I can't tell you how successful I have been with this strategy, but I can tell you some of the things that I do, since that's the question that you asked. I take time to get to know human beings. I had a really memorable experience in my Xero team when I visited my Canadian team for the second time in 3 years, but there was a big gap of pandemic in the middle. And one notable individual who is an absolutely lovely person, really a super valuable team member, both from the perspective of the professional capability that they bring and from the warmth of humanity that they bring. I had not met them before in person. And after we'd had a team lunch, they said, oh, geez, there you go. Kendra's actually a decent person and she's not really that scary. And it was a really interesting comment. I'm sure partially driven by the fact that it was going to make people laugh. But it was a really interesting perspective. What had helped that person get to the point where they felt that way? It was hanging out in person and having conversations about things that were not work related in a casual environment. So I personally really value time spent in person in environments where it's not all focused on what's happening today. I think that helps me learn. I know from me, when I'm talking about people more senior in an organization to me, I'm not interested in hearing what you did like over the holidays and like, you know, all that sort of stuff. If that's just like a broadcast to 700 people, that's not building an authentic relationship. But if we have an opportunity to sit down and share some of the things that make us interested outside of work, I do find that a really useful way to build an authentic connection. So spending time with people, building connections outside of the purely transactional day-to-day work, providing opportunities for people to do that in an anonymous way is a really interesting one. I've seen that go badly sideways at a company I worked at, not Xero, where they just went super toxic because people hide behind anonymity. So I'm cautious about anonymity. However, I think in a structured form like feedback surveys, it can be useful for you to hear the things that perhaps people are unwilling to say to you in person. So a mechanism like that. Definitely a mechanism of encouraging people to be comfortable speaking to anyone else in the team that they are comfortable with, and then using that person as a proxy to bring their challenges. I'll give you an example of why I think that's quite important. We're all people living our own lives. I have had situations in broad extended teams where for the place that the person was in their world, they were not comfortable speaking about conversation about their personal sexuality with a leader who was of the other gender. Now, you can agree or disagree with whether that was right. You can agree or disagree with whether it's cool that I prefer having a female GP rather than a male GP, but it is where that person was. It is where I am in terms of I prefer a female GP. But that person was able to use that sort of framework that we'd set up for them to actually reach out to a same-gendered leader within our space and bring the concerns that they had through that same-gendered leader. So they were able to sort of, I guess, see a different path through what is inevitably a hierarchy of communication. Those are three of the sort of things, I guess, that have worked for me. in the past 8 years. It's only a very small subset. I think it's very nuanced depending on who you are, whether you are part of a dominant culture, whether you are part of a dominant gender, whether you are part of effectively any majority. And I would be always super careful to try to mindfully reflect on where you sit and where your privilege is, and then really mindfully work on creating communication channels for people who perhaps don't have that level of societal privilege. It's a really complicated, nuanced one. I'd just say, if you think you've created a pathway, check whether that pathway works for the 80% who are, hey, let's be honest, in tech, usually white men, and check whether you need to create other pathways that will allow some of the less well-represented folk in your community to also feel comfortable raising questions and pointing out to you when you are not doing a great job. I've had the privilege of working with some people who were very close to me and were more than happy to tell me when I was being a dick. And you really want to cultivate those relationships. And they won't always be relationships with your direct reports. Sometimes they'll just be relationships with people that you happen to know in another context. And so they are super comfortable to come and tell you, dude, I know you mean well, but when you do this, it really does not land. So just stop doing that. Hang on to those relationships, because as a leader, they are super precious.
Kendra, there's been a question in the chat. So it's just on this.
Ethan, can you just elaborate on this? Because I've done so much talking that I'm a little unclear on what the this you're specifically referring to is. And I'm very sorry to hear that you can't speak without coughing. I hope you feel better soon. It's a really interesting one. I think two things that I think you can do, and it really will depend on the relationship that you have, right? I think you can, one thing where I think radical candor is a useful thing is that it's written down. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to try to explain it. It doesn't need to be your opinion. If it's a framework that works for you, you can politely suggest that your people leader or your people leader's people leader might like to read it, might like to invest in it, might like to bring that thinking into your company. So I'm being deliberately a little bit facetious, but I'm not at all facetious in the intent. I think it is a fantastic prop to the fact that this is both written down, it is in all sorts of different consumable formats, it's online, it's in videos, it's in coaching, it's in books. No matter how that person that you're attempting to perhaps build a stronger relationship with, so that you can both be in a place where radical candor is safe for you both. No matter the way they learn, you can find a format in which they can consume this content. So that's one thing I would definitely suggest. I've had fantastic relationships with direct people leaders. I've had relationships that are way more strained. I think we all learn to work the relationship with our direct boss in the way that works for them, and augment that in a way that works for us by perhaps working with their peers, their peers. I think it to me, it comes back to people are people. I work that relationship with my direct boss, and I've had wonderful bosses. I've had people I've gotten on with like a house on fire. I've had much more strained relationships. I've always worked on making the relationship with my direct boss the one that works the best that it possibly can for the two of us where we are at that point in our lives. Being upfront about the fact that's not always going to work for either of us superlatively, and looked to augment that relationship with other people. I'm a big proponent of the fact that you cannot just go, cool, we've both read this book and I'm going to be radically candid with you. And if you listen to a bunch of Kim Scott stuff, she'll be like, people have misused it in that way, right? They've misused it to say, all you need to do is read the book, and then we can absolutely all be radically candid with each other. Of course you can't. because the whole premise of the framework is built around you have to have a relationship of mutual respect. So I guess I have worked hard to try to strengthen the relationship of mutual respect so that I feel more confident having perhaps more edgy conversations, and where that person can be in a space where they can hear what I have to say in the best possible way. I hope that helps a little bit, Nathan. Ethan, I beg your pardon if I called you Nathan before. Sure. I choose not to work with those people if I can possibly avoid it. And I just say a little bit. I think it is super hard to get inside someone else's head. So I agree with you that that is a really a perspective that it's pretty easy to take on super senior folk in your company. I'm not giving an excuse for anyone who is a poor people leader and believes in do what I say, not what I do. I don't think there's any excuse for that. I do think that the roles of very senior people in substantial organizations are very complex, and because we're not walking in their shoes, I do think we need to give them at least a reasonable amount of belief that they see a different context from the context that we see. Now, really, really skillful senior leaders are able to help people understand that they see a very nuanced, complex context without needing that person to understand the full nuanced, complex context. That's too many X's and T's, but there we go. Asmita, I'm assuming we are very nearly out of time. Do we have time for one more question? Or?
Sorry, was on mute. Yeah, I think so. We should be able to fit one more in, and then yeah, I guess we can all jump back to work. If anyone has anything.
Anyone else with a burning question? Otherwise, I am always super happy to carry on conversations, offline. If you had a burning question that you didn't get a chance to answer, or it really didn't feel right for the context of a group, I'm a very strong believer in great people leadership being a really strong way to make your company stronger. So, hit me up and we can chat about something offline if that's more comfortable for you.
Hi, Kendra. Ted here. Thanks for talking today. Whenever I do these sort of moderations, I always say try to form your question in the form of a question. But I'm going to sort of violate my own rule right now. So when you talked about kind of Americans having a different style than Australians and that kind of thing, and then later on you said something that I have a very firm belief in, and that is words matter, and words have meaning. And I'm wondering how much of that difference is not so much difference in personalities or styles, but just differences in language. I mean, I often say I'm kind of bilingual. I speak both American and Australian. And they just have same words that have very different meanings in different contexts. And so where do you think that line is between difference of understanding versus actual difference in leadership styles and personalities?
I completely agree with you that words matter an enormous amount, and that we need to check whether the words that we're using are being interpreted at the ears of the listener in the same way. There's a very trivial example, but it's very funny, so I'm going to say it. We had an example where, as Kiwis and Aussies, we would talk about horse trading. So my fairly extensive, geographically extensive team used objectives and key results. And one of my delightful senior leaders said that, one of the things that happened during writing down of objectives and key results was there was a bit of horse trading, which is, you support this thing that I need you to do and I'll support. She said, we've got to get into the horse trading. And it wasn't until about a week later that we realized that most of our North American colleagues had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. And therefore, it wasn't a useful analogy because they just didn't use that vernacular. So couldn't agree with you more that words are important. I've lived and worked in both cultures, although albeit I haven't lived in the US for a long time. I have interviewed a lot of Americans, and I have interviewed into American-centric organizations. One, I think it's more of I don't know that it's necessarily the way that people choose to live or work or talk versus just the economic pressures in those two different areas. One thing I do believe I have seen is that Australians and New Zealanders are socialized to talk more about we and less about I, more about the team's achievements and less about their personal achievements. Americans, in my experience, are socialized to talk more about personal accomplishments. I say that socialized really carefully because I don't think that it's a distinction between what people value in an ordinary conversation between two human beings. I think it's a business practice that we are one set of hiring managers, recruiters, all the rest of it, simply expect people to describe the impact that they have made on their company in very personal, individual language in one recruiting culture. And in another recruiting culture, it is people interpolate differently about what you just said, about what your personal contribution to that work was. And certainly I noticed that when I was interviewing, I would say Kiwis, Aussies, Americans. Like Aussies are a bit closer to Americans, Kiwis are a bit further over in this way. If I was interviewing a Kiwi, I interpolated differently and therefore perhaps asked different questions for follow-up clarifications and stuff about the way they describe their personal achievements than I would when I was interviewing an American. So that's probably the one that stands out in my head. That's really funny, right? I can see how that could arise. Yes, there you go. I'll be careful next time I say take a punt. Yeah.
Yeah, I was the only one in the room that basically knew that the sides were misunderstanding each other.
Right. Yes, and it's like it's interesting, isn't it? Those cross-cultural interpreters are super useful. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. This has been really great, and I think we've all got some really good takeaways to take with us. I've just popped into the chat the page that we have set up. So if anyone wants to follow the page, connect with other people who are also going through their leadership journey, please feel free to do so. And just a reminder that the next session is going to be on early May, and it's going to be having difficult conversations within your team, and that's going to be run by Simon Wood. But for the rest of us, enjoy the rest of your day today, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.